Thank you.
Honourable Marianne Street.
Mr Speaker, I take great pleasure in rising to speak on the Marine Legislation Bill. Talk about having something handed to you on a platter. All of the work had been done for this bill by the previous Labor government. It had taken a number of years to get to the point where this legislation was written and ready to go. By the end of 2008, of course, we had an election, and there it sat on the new minister's desk. Here was something that could have been implemented immediately, but no, National reverted to type and said, this is an idea from the Labor Party, therefore we're not going to give it any credence whatsoever. It took a shipwreck. It took a disaster for somebody to go back and say, gosh, Minister of Transport, oh, were you meant to do something about this? What's this about a convention? Were you meant to, was there something, sorry Mr Speaker, not you, was the Minister meant to do something about this? What's our responsibility here? Even then, having all of the work done, everything prepared, legislation ready to go, everything handed to the Minister on a platter, he still didn't act for another 4 years. And even then, it's late. It should have been in by the 1st of January this year. So even then, the Minister couldn't get it right. So for David Bennett to whinge and moan about us saying that this, and my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway before me saying that it's a bit rich of the Labor Party to get up and complain, I'm sorry, there needs to be some responsibility sheeted home for why this wasn't managed earlier. 4 years they've had, and they've not been able to implement something that was all done and dusted and ready to go. So, Mr Speaker, we will continue to make that point. We are supporting the bill. We wish it had been given the chance by this government to pass before the Rena disaster. But the other thing that is of concern, well, let's just say we welcome it coming anyway, and fortunately, if there are not going to be penalties for us in getting it in late, international penalties for getting it in late, then that's well and good, but no thanks to the assiduousness of the Minister. Due to the government's failure to ratify the international conventions when the Rena crashed, of course, we know that it was only liable to pay $11.3 million of the clean-up costs for the Crown, which ended up being over $50 million. And while the government was able to negotiate that up to about halfway, it should not have been necessary for the government to go through those negotiations had it subscribed to these international conventions in the first place. So, Mr Speaker, I suppose there's one other thing that I just want to reflect on briefly. One of the parts of this bill sets a blood alcohol level of 0.05 for ships, for people in charge of ships, for people sailing ships. But they cannot bring themselves to do that for people driving lethal weapons on our roads. And I don't understand the difference. I don't understand why there should be one standard for maritime safety and quite another for road safety. More New Zealanders are going to be travelling on our roads than are ever going to be travelling on vessels covered by this legislation. So I would ask the Minister, one of the Ministers in the House, well, the Minister in the House, to consider that again, and don't be afraid to revisit. Don't be afraid to revisit legislation on alcohol limits, because I don't think the Minister got it right last time. And don't be afraid to revisit things, because it's perfectly clear that that Amy Adams has had to revisit a few things in the course of developing this legislation and contributing to it. In fact, there are in this 37 pages of amendments to the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Act that have been introduced in this legislation when National only passed that bill about a month ago. And so, from one shambles to another, although at the same time I do say to Minister Collins that should she choose to revisit blood alcohol levels, I'm sure there would be a number of people around this country who would be prepared and to welcome that. So Amy Adams has then brought forward 37 pages of amendments to a bill that she clearly didn't get right a month ago. So the primary aims of the amendments, and this is where I'm particularly interested, the primary aims of these amendments, which I do support, are to move the powers from Maritime New Zealand to the new Environmental Protection Authority. The Environmental Protection Authority is a regulatory body whose responsibility it will be under these amendments to monitor and regulate around waste dumping. The amendments go on to implement the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, as modified by the Protocol of 1978, and the implementing of the 1996 Protocol to the Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Wastes and Other Matter. Now, Mr. Speaker, the quality of our oceans is something that should be of concern to all of us. The original EEZ legislation was weak, it was inadequate, and 37 pages of amendments go some way to providing the EPA, with its regulatory oversight, the strength to monitor and to comment on and to regulate around waste dumping in our oceans. Because when people get out to sea and they don't think anybody can see them, they think it's fine to release waste into the vast oceans and it'll just wash away. But anybody who has travelled around the Pacific can tell you it doesn't wash away, it washes up. It washes up. So these amendments raise the question of why the Minister for the Environment had to dump the substantive changes in SOP 100 on Parliament after the Select Committee, rather than including it in the bill so it could be consulted on and people could submit on it. And it would also go some way perhaps to explaining why the EEZ legislation was rushed back from Select Committee, as the Maritime legislation bill has to be passed this year, and if it contained these amendments it couldn't be put into Parliament before the EEZ legislation was passed. So with that confusing set of consequences and timelines, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that ministers around this area, whether it be transport or environment, are clearly not across the detail of the job and not across the urgency of this job. Having been critical, Mr. Speaker, of the ministers in this regard, I still support the legislation. We wish it had happened years ago.
Denise Roche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to